This is the second lecture of the Williams Institute, the 2022 Williams Institute lecture by Dr. Teresa Delgado. I won't go through a full introduction of her again. Go back, please, if you haven't heard the first lecture and listen to it. It will, as a friend of mine would say, it'll bless your whole life. It certainly was thought-provoking and generative and gave us a lot to think about as an institution. And frankly, I think as a learning environment, whether we are part of it, TSO or not. Dr. Delgado is the Dean at St. John's University of their Liberal Arts and Sciences College, and she is a professor of theology and religious studies there. She came there after many years at Iona, where she had taught, and she's been very active. You may have got a hint of this with the Wabash teaching, Wabash Center, which works on teaching religion and theology. She's been very active there, and she served very well with the Forum for Theological Exploration, which has done a lot of training of future scholars. And so I think all of that may have been reflected in what you gave us last night. And so without much else to say, I invite you back to the podium to engage us for this second lecture. Thank you. Welcome her into the room.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you who are here today and those who are online. As Dr. mentioned, I have been very involved with the Wabash Center. And like I mentioned yesterday, one of the projects that has been funded by Wabash, it emerged out of a consultation on race consciousness. Wabash gathered cohorts of scholars in American Latinx cohort, and within the Latinx cohort, myself and 4 other scholars in theology and religion have been engaging in conversation, dialogue with each other and with theological institutions around this topic of the borderlands. How do we, in our theological institutions, think about, teach about, and learn about the borderlands? What does that require of us within our pedagogy and our processes and policies in our institutions? And not just because we are faced with changing demographics of our institutions. That's not the only reason. Also because talking about the borderlands asks us to be accountable, as I mentioned yesterday. So thank you again. And for those of you who are online and also here in person who attended yesterday, I ask that you indulge me in a bit of recapping from yesterday and drawing some of those themes into today, because I feel that they are important to reiterate. And I will begin again, because this is part of my commitment on accountability, to acknowledge the land that we are on the land of the indigenous peoples, the Erie, Shawnee, the Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandotte, Ojibwe, and Cherokee. And noting that how this part of the country, Ohio in particular, served as a place where indigenous people migrated to when they were sent out from other places and also were sent away from here through the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So again, I punctuate the start of this lecture by asserting the importance of our context. Physical context, because that context, we can't really think theologically without attending to that context, the context that exists for the borders and boundaries, physical and epistemological boundaries. So the title of my remarks today, taking that same theme, teaching Borderlands in the Midwest, is titled "The Gospel of Jesus as Border Thinking." So I like to again begin where I left off last night on the difference between border logics and thinking. And yesterday I examined 3 moments in recent memory to illustrate the border logic of white supremacy that is operative in this country. The first being Charlottesville, Virginia, with the Unite the Right rally in 2017. Second, Puerto Rico, with Hurricane Maria and its aftermath in that same year, and then at our nation's capital on January 6, 2021. All of these moments, particularly leading up to January 6th, Charlottesville and Hurricane Maria laid bare the realities of racism and colonialism, which are twin siblings of white supremacist parents, and that serve as an operative border logic of our nation's founding. And that those events stripped away the barrier that functioned to hide a deep wound that was shown in all of its infected, flaming heat at the Capitol. Last night, I outlined these distinctions between border logic and border thinking that deserve some reiteration today. Border logic is the static line carved into the land, pierced into our bodies, and established within the ways that we think, the ways that we know, including our theological discourse. That sets us apart one from each other, us and them. On the other hand, border thinking or borderlands thinking exposes the harm and damage, woundedness of border logic, because it reveals how it benefits a few and how that benefit is borne on the backs of others who bear their scars. And again, I'm going to draw from Chicana writer Gloria Anzaldúa, describes that distinction, where she says, she uses this term, una herida abierta, which is an open wound. She says the US-Mexico border is una herida abierta, an open wound, where the third world rates against the first ease. And for a scab forms, it hemorrhages again by flood of 2 worlds merging to form a third country, a border culture. She goes on then to distinguish that from a borderland. A borderland is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. It is in a constant state of transition. And then she goes on to talk about those who are considered trespassers or aliens, unwelcomed within that space. She calls them the squint-eyed, the perverse, the queer, the troublesome. And I repeat these because I'm going to use that terminology again and again as we look at the gospel of Jesus. I also drew from Rosario Ferre, and I've turned to Rosario Ferre as a Puerto Rican writer who passed away in 2016 because she has, in my view, used her privilege, her white Puerto Rican privilege. She comes from a family of status. Her father was a governor of Puerto Rico in the mid 20th century. So she has this perception, perspective that comes from the elite, and she uses that to sharply critique that same colonial culture. And she, in her poem on Language Duel, which if you read her book, Language Duel, she actually has her poetry in Spanish and in English on either side of the page. And she's playing with that. She's playing with, in some ways, the spine of the book creates a boundary between the two. The spine itself becomes the border between these two languages. And she speaks of it in the poem that I read to you last night, which I'll excerpt a bit today. She begins, why is it that in the year of our Lord 2001, Americans have such a difficult time learning Spanish? Because of e pluribus unum, because of the Civil War, because Catholicism and Protestantism, because papists and anti-papists, because La Leyenda Negra, which left King Philip II of Spain tarred and feathered in his underwear, sitting on the devil's rump. I have a surprise for you, it's for none of these reasons. It's still feuding in Florida, Puerto Rico, and California. In fact, I swear to you that as I talk to you in English about my right to speak in Spanish, I can hear the guns boom and see the cannonballs roar over my head. But there's nothing to be done. Two male crabs can't be this. So in this poem, she is exploring the ways in which our own abilities or inability to speak a languages simultaneously serves as a way to sever our tongues, to create this scar and this borderline, even within our very mouths, our bodies. So, border thinking, or thinking from the borderlands, is a space of resistance, and I drew from John Sobrino's theology of, spirituality of liberation to explore the fidelity to the real. And I believe that we must apply the same method to our theology, because when we don't, we silence those border dwellers, those squint-eyed, perverse, queer, and troublesome. And in doing so, we maintain that border logic of white supremacy and all structures of power over. So I'd like to turn now to Jesus as an example of one who dwells in and thinks from the border. And there's one gospel story that comes immediately to mind. Jesus' encounter with the woman accused of adultery in John's gospel. I couldn't help but think about the way John's gospel story of scribes and Pharisees trying to create a gotcha moment for Jesus has been read and reread, interpreted and reinterpreted as a story only about a woman taken into for adultery. Taken in for adultery. This is one of those gospel stories that takes on a life of its own. And I'm struck by the way our interpretive imagination, or perhaps our lack thereof, has assumed what the scribes and Pharisees claim is true. That this is a woman caught in the act of adultery. And that she deserves the shame and fear of being dragged into the temple, placed in the middle of a crowd of people, and condemned to the death. The line has been drawn in the sand, a border, a dividing line, a narrow strip along a steep edge, as Andalus says. Based on our belief in that assumption about this unnamed adulterous woman, we have read this story as a border logic between human sinfulness and divine forgiveness, of the grace that transcends judgment and condemnation, a morality tale of what not to do. Don't commit adultery, don't condemn others. A tale of go and sin no more. We know what we must do to stay on this one side of the border. And we know what must be done to keep others from entering our side. But I hear something different in this story. Something tells me that it's not the story. The timing of the story is not lost on me. Happening just after the chief priests and Pharisees had sent guards to arrest Jesus the day before, described in John chapter 7, verse 32. It is also the time not long before Jesus, an innocent man, would be handed over to the Roman authorities on false pretenses, to die a shameful death, a crucifixion, a public death reserved for the criminal, intended to terrorize others to stay in their place. He had just spent the night on the Mount of Olives before coming back to the temple in the early morning to teach the people. I see this moment as a liminal place and space, a liminal time, Jesus. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the only ones who accuse the woman of adultery are the same men who are also trying to entrap Jesus with his response. Jesus is the object of their scorn and displeasure. The woman is the objectified means to a calculated end. They are both functioning as the scapegoat in a classic sense. We don't hear from the woman until the end of this account, and only when Jesus asks her a direct question to which she responds. What if we were to hear from her earlier in the story? Would she say that she had not done what she was accused of doing? What if she were an innocent victim of sexual assault, blamed for a violation against her? Would she even have been believed in her own day? Would she even have been believed by those reading this gospel story in our own day? We are told that she was caught in the act of adultery, but where was her partner, who, according to the law, would be condemned to the same death? Was she set up, entrapped by the same men who sought to entrap Jesus by his response? And what if it were true? What if it were that she was caught in the act of adultery, of having sex with someone outside the bounds of the law? Is such a transgression deserving of public shaming and a public execution? These are the gaps, the silences that I hear. And as I consider the questions that the silence provokes, the story is opened up as a radical reimagining of power and privilege, of women's subjectivity against a world of objectification, and of Jesus's accompaniment solidarity. The story is opened up as a borderland where, as Ansaldúa describes, the only legitimate inhabitants are those in power, where tension grips the inhabitants of the borderlands like a virus, ambivalence and unrest reside there, and death is no stranger. As a borderlands story, with Jesus and the woman as the central figures, we are invited to consider the multiple truths existing simultaneously and Jesus's refusal to reinscribe the border logic of condemnation and judgment. Instead, he is willing to entertain the messiness of the borderlands, trusting in a God who enacts justice with mercy and grace, and mediated through love of neighbor, stranger, and enemy alike. In this telling, I can't help but think about the women dragged into the square for public shaming in our own day, based on assumptions of their sexuality. How women of color, trans women, for example, are hypersexualized in our society, portrayed in ways that underscore the supremacy and purity of white women, of cis women, to the inferiority and sinfulness of Black and brown women's bodies, and the extent our society will go to protect that dichotomy, that order logic. We are flooded by examples of such public shaming, maiming, and killing. Regina Maya Allen was shot at point blank range in Milwaukee in August of this year. A trans woman who succumbed to her fatal wounds, but not before she called the police to describe her assailant, who was arrested just 3 weeks ago. The United States is not alone in this. In Brazil in 2017, Dandara dos Santos was beaten, tortured, shot, and then her head was crushed, and the horrific crime was filmed and distributed on social media. In Mexico, with one of the highest rates of trans murders in the world, Saray Atenea, 31 years old, was killed in 2021, and her body was thrown in a canal that officials say is often used by organized crime figures. According to the Trans Data Research Organization, 375 trans and gender diverse people were murdered in 2021, 7% more than in 2020. 96% of those murdered globally were trans women or trans feminine people. 58% of murdered trans people whose occupation is known were sex workers. Murders of trans people in the United States have doubled from last year. People of color make up 89% of the 53 trans people murdered. 53%, it's hard for me to get through these statistics. 53% of the trans people murdered in Europe were migrants. 70% of all the murders registered happened in Central and South America, with 33% in Brazil. 36% of the murders took place on the street, and 24% in their own residence. The average age of those murdered is 30 years old, the youngest being 13 years old and the oldest 68 years old. Being the victim of operative border logics in one sense does not make one immune from enacting these logics in another. In this telling, I can't help but think about women caught in the wars waged by men, used as objects to take other men down in their vying and positioning for power. We know all too well how rape is used as a weapon of war, whether it's Congo or Ukraine. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine issued a report just last week that detailed war crimes, including the rape of girls and women ranging from 4 years old to 80 years old. Some Christian theologians, including Calvin, explain away the scandal of this text, that Jesus enacts no punishment, no condemnation for an adulterous woman, that he just lets her go. In fact, many since have asserted that although Christ remits our sins, I quote here one of the commentaries on this gospel, that although Christ remits our sins, he does not subvert social order.
Yet why is it not equally scandalous that the religious power structures of the time could have accused an innocent person, condemning her to death just to prove a point? And what responsibility do we have in undoing the systems and structures that make it all too easy to drag a vulnerable person into the middle of the square, to be stoned, to be lynched, to be raped, for all to see and participate in such a spectacle? I worry that our shame about this story has been misdirected. Have we become so desensitized to the borders we have constructed between us? Because we are so much more focused on shaming the squint-eyed, the perverse, the queer, the troublesome, the mongrel, the mulatto, the half-breed, the half-dead. In short, those who cross over, pass over, or go through the confines of the normal, rather than dismantling the structures that make such shaming all too easy. Jesus, the border thinker, Jesus, the border dweller, Jesus as the divine made flesh in the borderlands, Jesus who embodies the border between the human and the divine, refuses to participate in the shaming, objectification, and trickery that he is set up. He ignores the gotcha and writes in the dirt. Jesus affirms and dwells among the humanity of those the world would shame. Their stories are strikingly similar to me, Jesus and the woman accused of adultery, because they are both bound together by a border logic that seeks to drive a deep wedge between worlds. Una herida abierta. The real scandal exists in the manner they were treated by men in power, so ready to be handed over and sacrificed for the supremacy of their systems, religious and legal. Maybe we too are complicit in the scandal if we choose to read from the story only Jesus's response toward a sinful woman. In taking a step back, perhaps we can see the scandal of the bigger picture. At this point, I ask you to indulge me and for a few minutes, think about other examples that come to mind from your own experience with the gospel of Jesus as a border thinker. I was thinking about perhaps giving us an opportunity to have some time to talk with each other. I'm not used to lecturing for an hour over 2 days and don't necessarily think that that's the best use of time, especially when there is so much wisdom and experience in the room. So perhaps we can either in pairs or however we convene, and those online, if there is a way for some conversation to happen, to talk about what has bubbled up for you, come to mind, other ways that the gospel speaks to you as a borderland experience. And then we can reconvene in perhaps about 10 minutes to share those conversations that we had.
I'm going to offer just one brief thought and then see if anybody else wants to pick things up. I spent about 15 years living in Texas, which is, of course, on the border. So the question resonated with, or the discussion, her talk resonated with me from that angle. I also started thinking about the current borderland we have between our different political viewpoints. And in both of these borderlands, in some ways, those of us who were quote unquote on the right side of that border were often as victimized in our own ways as those on the other side of the border, the more explicit ones that she raised, in some ways because of what the system, the way it manipulated us to play along with the system, and in some ways because of those we were in relationship and the pain we went through with those who were caught in those situations. That there's some sense where if we are paying attention that we become like Christ in these dramas. Does that spark anything with anybody else?
Hey, Tim, this is Dean. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Dean. It's good to hear your voice this morning.
Yeah, you too. I'm sort of just listening in because I'm working at the same time on a paper that's due in the morning, and also have the lesson to prepare for in the morning. But yeah, those were good comments you made. I honestly didn't hear everything Dr. Delgado said, but I appreciate what you said, especially, not especially, but with regard to the political landscape. It seems like we've lost the ability to figure out a way to do the right things for the right reasons. And so people like immigrants are caught in the middle of all that, and we forget. Well, I don't forget, and I know you don't forget, but many, maybe most, forget that these are real people with real lives. In most cases, not all, but in most cases, they're just trying to find a way to survive, to make a living, to provide for their families. And so that's the part that causes me so much sorrow and anguish. The forgetting that these are real people, just like us in most cases, and they're just trying to do the best they can, and they can't win for losing. Congratulations, by the way. I saw the email message this morning that you have gotten across the hurdle, or what, I don't know exactly what it was. You've been recommended for commissioning or something to that effect.
Yeah, they're fully kicking me upstairs to the Board of Ministry. So I've got paperwork and interviews at that level before next summer's ordination.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I have my DCOM interview next Wednesday, a week from today. And God willing, that will be the outcome for me as well.
Good luck. I'll lift up a few prayers for you.
Thanks. Did the DCOM take you by surprise? It was anything they asked?
No, it actually, the advice I read online about reviewing the sacraments is good. What I ended up getting was just some detailed feedback.
Okay.
So turning this back to our primary discussion here, would other
Okay.
people like to join in? Mark, perhaps you?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Well, what strikes me through all this is the tension of competing theologies of what Christ-like means around the political volatility of the subject. And I'm fresh off a weekend with and I'm on the other end from you guys. I'm retired, and we just spent the weekend with 4 other couples, which is sort of a annual retreat. We were all dating these girls in college, and so now we come back 50 years later and talk about all these things. And one of the subjects was immigration, and there's just it is really difficult to, I don't think it's, from my perspective, it's not difficult to be Christ-like and embrace the human beings and share love, but it is very difficult to be Christ-like in pursuing the policies that provide a lot more comfort around this. And so I'm simply struck by the complexity and tension of it all, and a bit overwhelmed with the notion of being Christ-like in that regard.
Right.
Hi, everyone.
Yes, go ahead.
So last night, a question was asked in relation to being like Christ. And the question was, what frameworks are in place for immigrants, especially as the climate changes and there is climate migration or displacement? And so far, it seems there is nothing in place. But I found it a very good question, because if we are to be Christ-like, we have to think about how to legally let these immigrants in for, just to accommodate, to look up for them. And also because the crisis of climate change is really not their cause, really. They come from developing countries, and the countries did not contribute.
We're going to reconvene in just a minute.
Countries.
And as we do, we'll ask.
I was just thinking
You
about that,
Share
and I thought to be
a bit
quite
about the conversation that you've had
create
and
those frameworks so that
on
people don't end up in like trafficking,
our online folks first to do
legal
that.
professions,
But
and
it
just
sounds like
being
there's
sent
still
back to hard times back home. Thank you.
which is wonderful. Thank you so much. So what emerged in your conversations? And again, I'll go to the folks who are in our virtual room to share first.
Tim, go ahead. You're good at summing up what was talked about in groups.
Well, I will do my best. You may be overrating me, but I'll do my best here. So I began the discussion by raising the questions of the other borders we experience in our world. I spent many years near the Texas border. We have current borders in our political world, and those borders, oftentimes those of us who are quote unquote on the right side of those borders get pulled in. And I was pondering the question of how much we become like Jesus in those circumstances, particularly when we begin to recognize what's going on. There were several other people who brought in thoughts. Shima closed us out by resonating with questions from last night. What does it mean to be someone who's caught in a country that is being impacted by climate change on that kind of a border, and what obligation does that raise for us to open our doors in this country, open up that border to allow the people who've been impacted by our actions to migrate here? I believe I'm leaving some things out in between. I'll leave it to Mark and Dean if they would like to add to, or Shima if they would like to add.
Nothing from Mark.
Well, the only thing I would add to that, and you did a great job, Tim, thank you, is that I made the comment that, and this ties in with Mark, what Mark said, and what Shima said too, about being Christ-like. We seem to have lost the ability in the United States to do the right things for the right reasons. And we forget that the things that we do affect others. So yeah, that was what we talked about.
Thank you very much for engaging in that conversation. How about those here in the room? Who would like to share from each of the various groups? Yes, and thank you. If you can go to the microphone, because then the.
So I really wanted Dr. Reverend Jack to speak about this, because he just got back from, he does work around the death penalty. And one of the pieces that you provoked was this question about who we shame, who gets these death penalties and why. And one of the things that he said was, it's always the poor people without power who actually end up with the death penalty. You don't rarely do the rich and powerful get even sentenced, let alone get a death penalty, let alone shamed. I know we have the so-called, he didn't say this is me talking now. We have the so-called cancel culture, but the truth of the matter is you can't cancel people with power. They don't get canceled. I mean, they might get shamed for a brief moment, but they reinvent their lives in other ways. So that piece about who is, I think the thing you said about Jesus and the woman sharing this commonality, this accompaniment that Jesus does, because these same people had come after him. And that question of how do we see the system that is coming after us? How do we see it as the same thing as opposed to, oh, somebody did that to that person and somebody did that to somebody else, as opposed to seeing it as the logics that you talked about.
This didn't come up in our conversation directly, but it reminds me of a Brian Stevenson quote that the criminal justice system works better for the rich and the guilty than the poor and the innocent. And that came to mind as I listened to that. The business speak.
Thank you very much. I guess you can just pass the microphone to someone else that they wanted to share. Oh, yes.
Okay, I just wanted to say that in our conversation, we did stick to the question you asked about where else do we see Jesus refusing to join the Borderlands. We had so many examples, including the time when he encountered the blind and disciples wanted him to declare kind of sin. So he made, or the parents did. And there are many, many examples we came up with that is Samaritan. The time. Yeah, so we had so many examples. And another thing that came into in our conversation is how it seems like the issue is really not on immigration, crossing borders. It's welcome, it's not. We affirmed that indeed the issue is more racial than worrying that there is crowd getting in the country. It's not about people coming, it's who is coming.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, there have been statements, you know, when the quiet part is said out loud, about, you know, why not have folks? We'd love to have folks from Norway and Finland, Sweden, as opposed to those from Haiti or Venezuela. Other reflections?
One of the stories that Michaelan, the student I was talking with, brought up was the story of one who touches the hem of Jesus' garment, who's suffering from some kind of specifically disease, right? And talking about how the disabled community views that story. So that's another one that gets read from that border logic, that the point of the story is that Jesus heals her and brings her out of that condition. Right? But what does it mean that she's the one who goes to Jesus and seeks after him? And the text says, draws the power out of him. It's a very different way to read that story than her being accepted into normality.
Thank you for sharing that, because it compels us to say where those on the underside, they are, you know, seeking to be seen and to be heard, and how often does that not happen? Other reflections. Wanted to put anyone on the spot.
Hi. Nicole and I spoke about a few different examples. Nicole brought up the Samaritan, and I brought up it's not Jesus directly, but it's a story in Acts of Philip and it's I brought that story up as an story as an example of border logic, because I feel like Philip kind of he erased the border that the Nick had in their head of I cannot baptize, I cannot do this, and that. It's like, oh no, you can. So that's just an example of that.
Thank you for sharing that, and I appreciate you raising this, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Just about a week or so ago, I sat in on a lecture given by one of the faculty at St. John's, and this is exactly the text that she was exploring with her students, and she helped me to see more fully the way in which that text has been read, and using the work of Amy Jill Levine to unpack the way that that story has been read and reread through an anti-Semitic lens, and that typically the typical reading, and I admit that this is the way that I was kind of taught and grew up understanding this particular story, which is to say that, how we are to follow in the footsteps of the Samaritan. That's really, that's the one that we're identifying with the story. And Amy Jill Levine's work has illustrated the ways in which, if we're really honest with ourselves, we are more closely identified with every person who walks by. And perhaps for good reason, for our own sense of safety, for our own, concern about what would it mean for me to stop. And yet we're pushed. The power of that parable is an overturning of the kinds of logics that are put in place that say that are where we're thinking about ourselves and our own safety first. And the real question is the question that she uses, Amy Jill Levine uses Martin Luther King's speech right before he was assassinated in Memphis, going to advocate on behalf of sanitation workers. And the question that he asked was, what will happen if I'm not there? What will happen if we don't respond? What will happen to them? Not to me, what will happen to them? And are we willing to ask ourselves that question when it will lead, when it could very well lead to our own death? So thank you for raising that story, because it is another example in my mind of the way in which it is so difficult to unhinge the kinds of border logics that we have been so accustomed and made so comfortable within, and how the real scandal of the gospel is how that gets over and over again. Example after example, Jesus shows how we must do that, how we must.
Make me want to reflect on what you said in this way, which is, you said use the word comfortable, which I want to now ask you to talk more about, because one of the things that I think, I'm talking about theological education in churches now. How many times I have heard people say, I don't want my people to be uncomfortable. And how many times I've heard people say as pastors, oh, people don't care what you say, do until they know you love them, and they equate love with not making people uncomfortable. And that phrase, uncomfortable, is a border logics phrase. I'm using your language now, which is, we don't want to be forced out of our comfort zones. which is its own kind of border, like a created border out of the logics that underpin all of our thinking. So I just want you to reflect on that, particularly because you use that word comfortable. That's literally what I think is a core issue for us.
At the risk of making some people feel uncomfortable here, let me say this. I don't know how you can read the gospel and be comfortable. I don't know how you can, and maybe this is the Catholic talking. When I walk into a church, I see a body on a cross. It's a very different kind of affect of walking into a Catholic church and seeing a body on a cross than walking into a Protestant church and seeing a cross without a body. And I note that because as a Catholic Christian, I'm faced with the discomfort of that image all the time. And I guess that there's some who argue that seeing that body on the cross can have multiple effects. It can either make one desensitized to the actual, the reality of that gruesome, horrific, terrorizing lynching, and to be exposed to it every time one witnesses it, or to somehow on the other side say, well, to be, accused of glorifying the suffering. And I would say that for me, taking the body on the cross serious means that I am forced to be uncomfortable all the time. Do you think it was easy for me to read those statistics? Because those statistics are not a number. Those are real people, real bodies. And it arrests me in my throat to have to read that. I am made uncomfortable. And I have to be. We have to be. Otherwise, we don't see in the clearest and most contextual way the gospel calls us to see. So whether it's on the issue of trans people being murdered, or children being put in cages on the border, or Black people being shot by police, if it doesn't shake us and make us uncomfortable, and if we don't make the connection between those stories happening now and the gospel story, then I don't know why we're in the business. I really don't. To me, that's the shame. That's the heresy. So I don't think we can talk about the gospel. And our education, our theological education, has to be about, or else we're missing.
Question I have, I think it's similar to what was asked last night. And I think it's prompted by what was said prior to attending to what you just attended. In the witnessing, for Christ and in embracing, living out the border thinking. We also could be successful in that. We hold not to the borders ourselves. I think sometimes the border thinking could easily create its own border logic. Because we are so frustrated. Like when you read the statistics, I quickly had the border logic towards people inflicted such level of pain. And I think last night Shema asked about forgiveness, and I also, as you were discussing, I was reflecting on Jesus extending amazing grace, I should say, or we read the story of Stephen trying to bless people who are busy killing. My question is, how would you advise people that thinkers to overcome the urge to build the down in border logic? Thanks.
Thank you for that question. I would say that the one first thing would be that if one feels comfortable, maybe connecting back to just about comfort, that comfort is a clue that order logic is on, particularly within theological education. That kind of, we get a little full of ourselves, perhaps, thinking that we have that right answer. And maybe there are more who need to be part of the conversation. So I would say, as difficult as this may be, to keep expanding, stretching the margins of those fears as a way, not as a fail-safe, but at least as an attempt to not get too comfortable looking within. And there's so many ways that we do that, right? I mean, we have echo chambers and circles of conversation and discussion among those with whom we agree. And how do we continue to stretch them? And at the same time, still remain true to our understanding of the gospel message of justice and love, not giving up on those principles, but holding them in tension. That would be at least beautiful.
Friends, we're at the end of our time together today. Would you help me thank Dr. Teresa Delgado for what she's brought to us these last 2 days? And I want to say to you that this will live with me for a long time. It's really provoked a lot of thinking, but not just thinking. I don't want to make it sound like that's separated from all of what it's done. So I want to thank you on behalf of MTSO, on behalf of the president, Dr. Reverend Rundell. Did you want to say anything? President? Thank you. And thank you for those who are online and for those who will watch this later, because we're going to certainly disseminate it. Thank you very much. And thank you for coming out. Bless you. Bye.